Hello and welcome to the Kyiv Post Podcast with me, Rahim Rahemtulla. In today's programme, we'll discuss the ins and outs of the Kyiv property market and we'll find out what plans Ukraine's biggest oyster farmers have for the future. But first, with everything else going on in Ukraine, it's easy to forget that the country is still at war. Our correspondent Will Ponomarenko has been to the front line and he joins me now. Will, you've been to Avdiivka in the Donbas region. It's a city controlled by the Ukrainian government, 600 kilometers southeast of Kyiv. You witnessed there how Ukrainian soldiers are fighting Russian-backed separatist forces at very close quarters, and you say this is rather unusual for the war zone.
You see, the war in Donbas is usually considered as the long-distance war. I mean, the front lines are divided by hundreds of meters between them. It's the no man's land or gray zone. In Avdiivka, in the very southern edge of Avdiivka, there is an industrial zone, just 1 square kilometers. So everything happens within that buildings. And all the hell's power, all the power of artillery, all the power of the shelling is laid upon that building there. It's controlled by Ukraine, so everything happens in the very close quarters. It's not very unusual for this war. It was a usual situation back in 2014, but for now, it's very symptomatic. It's very unusual for the front lines in Donbas. And this close combat, as we call it, this makes the war even more brutal.
Now, well, in spite of the fighting, which has dragged on for nearly 3 years, you give the impression that among the soldiers there is a sense of fraternity and that morale is actually reasonably high, at least where you were in Avdiivka. Is that true generally of the Ukrainian forces?
This is true generally. The morale is very high, is extremely high. It sounds weird, but it is. Why? Because I would say the closer you get to the final frontier, the very hell of war, the better is motivation and situation among the military personnel. Why is that so? The soldiers at the front line, especially when it's very dangerous, are motivated. They control the situation, they train, they know what to do in any situation, they trust their commanders. By now, Ukrainian army learned to select its fighters for the most dangerous front lines. So the fighters who unfit for such dangerous missions are selected out and thrown out to other combat missions.
Looking at the broader picture of this conflict, what was the sense on the ground that you got there? Are the Ukrainians or the Russian-backed separatists now really making attempts to gain new territory? Or, from what we've heard, this is really just a stalemate now, and the only solution is going to be a political one rather than a military one? Was that the impression that you got?
Yeah, by now this war is the usual stalemate, but there are some occasions that when forces advance slowly and in creeping tension. For instance, we got the news from Svetodarsk, Rahim, near Debaltseve, that Ukrainian forces advanced 1 kilometer towards Debaltseve in the gray zone. So it's usually a stalemate, but considering the motivation, usually against the Ukrainian forces in the most dangerous front lines, there's a foreign mercenaries, including from Russia. Foreign mercenaries, they are not motivated to die. They don't care about that Avdiivka. They don't want to die there. What they want is to gain some combat experience and maybe some money. For instance, I've been told that in the Avdiivka industrial zone, there were at least dozens of Chechen fighters. They are not motivated, so Ukrainians are being defenders of their own land, standing in defense on their own ground. So they are much more motivated. So generally it's a stalemate, and I think for nearest years, till the end of the decade, the stalemate fighting will be going on. But after this trip to Avdiivka, I made up my mind that Ukraine is doomed to win. For one little reason is because there is a young man fighting for them. In the Avdiivka industrial zone, there are lots of young soldiers of only 18, maybe 20 years old. And they believe what they fight for, they know what they fight for, so they are the seeds of victory in Ukraine. The young generation of Ukrainians, they want to fight. They are not tired of the war.
Well, that's a very interesting assessment of the situation. Thank you very much for joining us here on the podcast.
Thank you.
That was Will Ponomarenko on Ukraine's war in the Donbas. We turn now to property in the Ukrainian capital. This week, the Kyiv Post has launched its first ever real estate magazine, where we look at the industry from a variety of angles. Helping us do that has been staff writer Josh Kavensky, who joins me now. Josh, you were looking at financing in the property market, or rather the lack thereof. This is having serious consequences for developers and for potential buyers. So tell us what's going on and what's led to this situation.
Well, the main thing is that, as you mentioned in your introduction, although there are means of financing, there are ways to get financing. It's difficult, and the ways that people get financing tend to be from alternative financial instruments that aren't regulated by the national bank and that occur not through banking establishments, but rather through people who just generally, through companies or people that just aren't really used to lending. Why is that the case? Well, banks haven't really given mortgages in Ukraine in any large scale since the 2008 financial crisis. They're sort of starting to ramp it up again, and 2014 happened. So mortgage lending is zero, essentially. There are a few, but it's very small. Then on a larger scale, it's very difficult for developers to get lending because banks in general are still recovering from the crisis and are incredibly unwilling to lend money in any large way. So that kind of explains why we're here.
And so if there's no mortgage lending, for someone who's looking to buy a flat or a house, what options do they have? Presumably just paying in cash is one.
Yeah, that's one option, and it's fairly widespread, largely because people kind of want to get around the red tape, so that's definitely an option. In terms of buying apartments, especially the most interesting area is buying an apartment in a building that's not yet been built. It's interesting for a lot of reasons. One of them is because that's the easiest way to get cheated. It's a way. One thing that often happens is investors, and that could be individuals who are trying to buy an apartment or larger kind of enterprises, will put money in, and the developer who was supposed to build the building will just disappear with however much money he was given to build some apartment complex. In terms of how that usually kind of occurs, individuals can sign contracts, either buying construction financing bonds, which is rare, or they can invest in a development fund, in return for which they will get the right to an apartment in the newly built complex. So that's definitely one way it works. That being said, the reason that these financial instruments are even available is because of something that happened in 2008, where there was a big complex that was going to be built called the Odesa Center, and that did not happen, and a bunch of people lost money. So the Rada passed all these laws, and now they're kind of used as a way to kind of regulate this process, but the vast majority of it, as far as I understand, still kind of occurs outside the purview of the law.
And if we look at this from the point of view of an investor, as opposed to just someone looking to buy an apartment for themselves, one broker told me that IT, agriculture, and property are essentially the three strongest areas in the Ukrainian economy. You also say that in the residential sector there's a certain amount of oversupply, which is driving prices down. So with these things all together, it looks like now for an investor this could be a good time to get into Kyiv property.
Yeah, maybe. In terms of oversupply, what people were saying was that it's oversupply in certain segments of the market in certain areas. So one way to think about it is that people in Ukraine have money, just not a lot of it. So the kinds of apartments they are willing to buy or invest in tend to be apartments of smaller sizes. Unfortunately, developers in Kyiv have not built apartments that are small. What they built are a lot of luxury apartments and a lot of apartments in luxury areas and apartments that are just sort of bigger, targeting a middle class that does not exist in Ukraine. But the issue, I think the caveats there are the same as for everything else in Ukraine, which is that, without law enforcement and without strong investor protection laws, there's always a possibility that you're going to lose a lot of money, and you're not going to have legal recourse. Or if you do, it's going to be such a long-term hassle that it might not even be worth the process of getting your money returned. And beyond that, it's just, you could also invest in something, and the person, as I mentioned, that lead the center, the person could make off with your money, and there won't be a lot you can do.
Well, Josh, sounds like risks, opportunities abound, as ever.
That's true. Yep, thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast. Josh Kavensky on real estate in Ukrainian capital Kyiv. And finally, oyster farming. This, as it turns out, is a growth business in Ukraine. Alyona Zhuk has been covering the story, and she joins me now. So, Alyona, there's a new oyster bar in Kyiv. Tell us more about where this has come from and who's behind the venture.
There are two Ukrainian men. They jokingly call themselves Oyster Kings. A couple of years ago, they decided to launch a Ukrainian oyster farm because there wasn't any. They traveled all around Europe and lived at oyster farms and tried and watched and learned how to manage that. And they bought young oysters at a French oyster farm, and they tried to find a place in Ukraine, in the Black Sea, where they would not only survive but also grow. And they found a place in Odesa Oblast. And now, like a year and a half after they started, they produce up to 4 tons of oysters per month, selling that to Ukrainian restaurants and big supermarket chains. So now, naturally, they decided to open an oyster bar in Kyiv, the first one.
And you write that oysters were popular and they were cheap, but then they were declared bourgeois by the communists. Do the pair now who are behind this new bar, do they see that the Ukrainian market is ready to embrace oysters?
Well, it already does embrace oysters, because the production of oyster farm of this man, it covers 40% of Ukrainian market, and the rest, 60%, is imported oysters, but they plan to ramp up the production and produce more and sell more and cover more of the demand of the market.
They've also got big plans to export oysters beyond Ukraine. They think they could have success, partially because, as I understand, the taste of their oysters is different from what else is available on the market.
Yes, that's correct. They say that many Europeans who love oysters tried the ones grown at their farm, and everyone said they were fantastic. And the thing is that the water in the Black Sea is less salty, so the taste of the oysters is more delicate. And of course, Ukrainian oysters are much cheaper.
Well, Alona, it sounds like the world is their oyster. So thank you very much for joining us here on the podcast.
Thank you.
Alona Zhuk on oyster farming in Ukraine. And on that note, that's where we'll have to leave it for this week. Many thanks for listening. And remember, if you want to read more about any of the stories we've been discussing here on the podcast, you can do so at our website, kyivpost.com. Until next week, goodbye.